You've probably heard that 10,000 hours of practice is all it takes to master anything. You've probably also assumed that's backed by real science. It's not in the way you think, and the researcher who did the actual study has spent years trying to correct the record. Start with a real case that sits right in the middle of this argument. Stephen Curry, coming out of high school, was skinny, undersized, and largely ignored by major basketball programs, including Virginia Tech, his own father's alma mater. Only Davidson, a small mid-major program, offered him a scholarship. He wasn't a can't-miss physical specimen. What he had instead, by every account from people who trained alongside him, was one of the most obsessive practice regimens in the sport. Routines built around hundreds of repetitions, tracked makes, and drills designed specifically to correct tiny flaws in his shooting mechanics. That's not something you're born with, he said about shooting control. You have to practice it. 7 years after being passed over by bigger programs, he was the 7th overall pick in the NBA draft. He'd go on to become one of the greatest shooters the sport has ever seen. It's a great story for the practice beats talent side of this argument. It's also more complicated than that, and the actual research behind it is where things get genuinely contested. In 1993, psychologist Anders Ericsson and his colleagues published a study on violin students at a music academy in Berlin. They divided the students into groups based on skill level and tracked how much time each group had spent in what Ericsson called deliberate practice. Focused, effortful, error-correcting practice, not just casually playing for fun. The best group had accumulated, on average, around 10,000 hours by age 20. That number, buried in an academic paper almost nobody outside the field would ever read, was about to take on a life of its own. In 2008, journalist Malcolm Gladwell turned that finding into the centerpiece of his best-selling book, Outliers. The message got simplified along the way. 10,000 hours of practice, and you too can become an expert at basically anything. Talent, in this popular version, barely mattered. Effort was everything. It became one of the most repeated ideas in self-help culture for the next decade. Curry's own story got folded into that narrative constantly. There's a problem. Ericsson never said that. He later wrote an entire section of his own book specifically to correct the record. His actual finding was narrower and stranger than the popular version. 10,000 was the average for the best group, but many of the best violinists had accumulated substantially fewer hours by that age. It was never a guarantee. It was an average from one narrow domain, with huge variation underneath it. Then in 2014, the debate got a lot more pointed. Psychologist Brooke McNamara led a massive meta-analysis pulling together data from dozens of studies across music, sports, games, and other skills, trying to answer a bigger question. Across everything, how much does deliberate practice actually explain? The number that came back was small. In some domains, practice accounted for a tiny fraction of the difference between people. In certain skill categories, less than 1%. Ericsson pushed back hard. His argument was that McNamara's analysis was mixing real deliberate practice with what he called ordinary experience, just doing a thing repeatedly without the focused, error-correcting structure his original research was actually about. McNamara's side pushed back too, accusing Ericsson of an unfalsifiable position. If a study finds practice matters less than expected, is the response always going to be that it wasn't real deliberate practice? Here's where Curry's story actually cuts both ways in this fight, if you look closely. His practice was genuinely the deliberate kind, tracked, structured, specifically designed to correct mechanical flaws, exactly what Ericsson's framework predicts should matter. That part supports the practice side, but dig one layer deeper and there's a detail that gets left out of the inspirational version. His father, Del Curry, was a 16-year NBA veteran and one of the best three-point shooters of his generation. Steph didn't just inherit a work ethic. He grew up inside an NBA locker room with elite coaching and genetic proximity to shooting mechanics from before he could walk. Separating practice from environment and genetics in a story like his is nearly impossible, which is exactly the mess researchers run into every time they try to isolate one variable in the real world instead of a lab. The evidence taken as a whole doesn't cleanly support practice is everything or talent is everything. It supports something messier. Deliberate practice appears necessary for reaching elite levels in nearly every domain studied. Nobody becomes a grandmaster or a professional shooter without an enormous amount of structured, effortful work. But it also doesn't appear sufficient on its own. Individuals given identical practice conditions consistently show different learning rates and different ceilings that practice time alone doesn't explain. Sports adds a layer the Ericsson-Gladwell debate rarely focused on directly. Physical traits that can't be trained into existence at all. Height, limb length, fast twitch muscle fiber ratios. These vary by genetics in ways that set hard boundaries no amount of deliberate practice can cross. Curry's undersized frame worked against him at recruiting time precisely because size is one of those traits practice can't manufacture. His shooting could be built, his height couldn't. So the real answer isn't a clean percentage split between nature and nurture, and anyone offering you one is oversimplifying a genuinely unresolved scientific argument. What the evidence actually supports is closer to this. Talent and environment appear to set the range of what's possible, and practice determines how close a person actually gets to the edge of it. Curry didn't overcome a total absence of advantage. He combined a rare environment with an even rarer amount of deliberate work, and the result looked, from the outside, like a pure triumph of effort alone. Maybe the more useful question was never which one matters more. It's why a single misread statistic, stripped of its nuance and turned into a slogan, ended up shaping how millions of people thought about their own potential, for better and for worse, more than either researchers' actual findings or Curry's actual story ever did.